introduce to you Dr. Elliot Friedman, that is going to be our guest speaker today. And Dr. Friedman is the William and Sally Berner Hanley Associate Professor of Gerontology at Purdue University and is in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. The topic is called Well-Being, What It Means and Why It Matters for Most Older Adults. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Let me just bring up the slides here. So I thought I would start with just a quick introduction of who I am and where I've come from, at least my intellectual journey to this point. When I entered graduate school, I was very interested in the biology of psychological experiences, so why things like stress affect the immune system and make us sick. And so I did a lot of work looking at the interaction of basic biological systems of the body, as shown on this slide, the endocrine system on the left and the central nervous system in the middle and the immune system on the right, and how they talk to each other in response to stressors and how they make us more susceptible to illness. But as I went along, it became pretty clear that these systems are not functioning in a vacuum, that they are in people that have different psychological makeups and different social experiences and different life experiences. And these things change over the course of the lifespan as well, and it becomes a lot more complicated and interesting. And so what my work right now still focuses, there's a biological element to it and an interest in health, but it's mostly about how health is, the needle on health and biological processes are moved in older adults by things like psychological experiences. So that takes us to the topic for the day. So what I want to do is start with something that will seem not the least bit surprising, which is sort of typical notions of, if you ask people what old age means to them, you get a word cloud like this. So characteristics like forgetful and slow and frail and grumpy and things like that. And what I want to suggest in the course of our time together this morning is that those images of older adults, and especially the extent to which older adults believe those characteristics are true of themselves, can have an impact on health. And my interest is in the reverse. That is, if we, to the extent that people can have a positive view of themselves and their lives, is that better for their health? And I think there is mounting evidence that it is. So here's what I want to try to accomplish, and we'll try to do this in about half an hour or so. First, start off with just some basic definitions. Then I want to try to convince you that well-being is a critical component of health, and it's an independently critical component. That is, over and above everything else that's going on in later life, differences in well-being can make a difference for health. And then finally, not to leave everybody hopeless, there's growing evidence that the kinds of well-being that matter for health can actually be cultivated, promoted, increased, even at the end of the lifespan. So the first question is, what do we mean by healthy aging? And I think we could imagine this kind of a perspective that as we get older, we tend to accumulate disease. So on the y-axis is anything you want to put: disease, disability, risk of mortality, risk factors for disease like inflammation, which is one of my interests. And as we get older, we just see rising levels of these things, and that would be considered typical. But we tend to be very interested in the people that accumulate these things at a faster rate and at a younger age. And we know a lot about the kinds of reasons that this kind of a trajectory might happen. People may have genetic predispositions to accelerated aging, but more likely it has to do with what happens to them during the course of their lives. So where they fall in the social hierarchy. Are they wealthy or are they very poor, for example? We now know that social isolation is incredibly toxic for health. So the extent to which people feel socially connected or socially isolated from one another, more social isolation is going to predict worse aging. And then psychological characteristics, particularly things like stress and depression, can put you on one of these more disadvantageous trajectories of accumulating illness, more illness over time and at younger ages. But what's also true, and something that I think has been largely ignored, at least until recently, or at least overlooked in the bulk of the scientific literature anyway, is that there are also better trajectories where people tend to accumulate disease, disability, cognitive impairment, and so on at a much lower rate, if at all, as they age. And we are certainly concerned about the people that are on the red trajectory because they are the ones that are suffering the most. But maybe we can learn something from the people that are on the more advantaged trajectory to help people that are worse off. And what I want to try to suggest is that on this advantage trajectory, it's not just the absence of the kinds of things that put you on a high risk pathway, but it's the presence of potentially protective factors, things like psychological well-being. So in order to get a handle on these healthy aging ideas, a very influential paper came out in 1987 by Rowe and Kahn, and this may be familiar to some of you. I think it's been out for quite a while and it's made a lot of headway. And they tried to wrap their arms around the idea of healthy aging and what it might mean and what the formula for healthy aging might be. And in 1987, they proposed three hallmark characteristics, being the absence of disease and disability, good cognitive functioning, so little cognitive impairment, good physical functioning, and then finally the ability to and the desire to remain engaged in meaningful life pursuits, including productive activity and rich social relationships. And if you have all of these, if you can tick off the boxes, if you have all of these three things, you would be considered to be enjoying healthy aging, according to Rowe and Kahn. And they came back 10 years later in 1997, revisited their formulation here and decided that life engagement in particular was an important feature of healthy aging, but they maintained the emphasis on physical health and cognitive health as well. And not surprisingly, there are not many people that could satisfy all these criteria. As we get older, we tend to get sicker, we tend to see slips in function. And studies that have looked at, epidemiological studies that have looked at how many people would actually be considered to be aging healthily, it's fewer than 20% in the United States and in Canada. So it's not many people can meet these criteria. The work that I do involves large data sets, and I'm going to show you a little bit of data from these, not to go too far into it, but the one study I've spent a lot of my time on is the Midlife in the United States, or MIDUS study. This has been going on since the mid-90s, as you can see, when people were between 25 and 75 years old back in the mid-90s, and they've been followed ever since. There have been 2 additional waves of data collection in the mid-2000s and more recently in the mid-2010s. It's a nationally representative sample of adults, and what's wonderful about the MIDUS study for people like me is that it brings together data on health, demographic information, work histories, and also measures of biology and very good measures of psychological functioning. So if you want to sort of look at how all those things interact, this is one of the few studies that lets you do it. If you look at health in the MIDUS sample, these 25 to 75-year-olds as they get older, you can see that at different ages, it's exactly what you would expect. So 65-year-old, if you look on the left-hand side of this slide, 65-year-olds have more chronic conditions, things like diabetes and heart disease, hypertension, than people that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's pretty much as we get older, we get sicker. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see an equivalent increase in functional limitations, and these are the extent to which your health limits your ability to do things like climb stairs and carry groceries and things like that. And not surprisingly, people in their 60s have more of these limitations than people in their 30s and 40s. In addition, we can look at how people change over time. So these are the same people being examined first in the mid-90s and then again in the mid-2000s, and just looking at chronic conditions. Again, things like diabetes and heart disease and hypertension, things like that. And within the same people, you can see that as they age, they have more of these chronic conditions. So it's not just differences between 60-year-olds and 30-year-olds, but even among 60-year-olds, as they get older, they have more conditions. They accumulate more conditions. And again, this is nothing surprising. This is what we would expect. Older adults know this. So if you ask them to judge their own health, their perceptions of their health on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being poor and 5 being excellent, you can see that older adults tend to rate their health as being not quite as good as younger adults. Older adults also, both in terms of physical health on the left and mental health on the right. So the first thing to notice is that older adults are rating their health lower. But the second thing to notice is that they are still rating their health pretty good. It's on the scale, it's somewhere between good and very good. So in spite of the accumulation of more disease and more functional limitations, they tend to feel pretty positively about their health. Moreover, if you ask them to compare their health to others in their peer group, they think they're doing a whole lot better. So upwards of 90%, even all the way out to age 65, think they're better off or much better off than people at the same age. So they tend to think they're doing pretty well compared to others. So I suggested earlier that by these criteria of being disease-free and not having any kind of cognitive and physical impairments, fewer than 20% of adults would satisfy those criteria of aging successfully or being healthy aging. If you ask them if they themselves think they are aging successfully, 50% or more of older adults say they are. So, by the Rowe and Kahn criteria, they're not, but their own subjective perceptions of their own aging, by their own judgment, they feel that they are. And they're not lying to themselves. They know that they're becoming more impaired. They know that they have more diseases, but they still feel like they are aging successfully. So this is where things get very interesting for someone like me, because what that means to me is that they're using a different set of criteria to judge successful aging. They're not judging on the basis of the presence of disease or physical impairment. They're judging by other criteria that are important to them. So what might those be? In one of my favorite studies, a researcher sat 22 women who were 60 years old or older living in San Diego County down and interviewed them and basically asked them open-ended questions about what do you think aging successfully means? What is important? What are the important elements? And she did extensive interviews with these women and then took her data back to her office and analyzed them and tried to pull out themes that seemed to be common to all of these interviews that she had conducted. And what Jennifer Reichstadt found was that there were a handful of themes, common elements in these responses, and these are these. So these 4 elements tended to show up in the accounts of successful aging that these women gave. So one is positive attitude. So you don't feel sorry for yourself. You don't say, woe is me, I can't do that because I have this. Those words do not exist in successful aging. So for these women, maintaining a positive attitude is an important element in successful aging. Another is self-acceptance. That is, of course you know that you're not in your 30s and your 40s anymore, but the important thing is saying, okay, that's all right. I'm gonna shift, I'm gonna modify, I'm gonna find ways to continue to feel engaged, do the things that I like doing. I may not run marathons anymore, but maybe I can walk a 5K or something like that. The third is purpose, this idea that your life continues to have a direction, you can continue to find ways to grow as a person, seek new experiences, and one of these ones that I love, do things you really want to do. I mean, if you've got the money and you love to take cruises, for God's sake, take cruises. And then finally, social relationships, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody listening, that being socially connected is a critical component of healthy aging, and these women agree. But what I find interesting about this particular quote, every social interaction that I have is always a learning process. So it's not just about being socially connected, but interactions with other people also can contribute to a sense of continuing to learn and continuing to grow. So you recognize that none of the things that these women volunteer as important components of healthy aging have anything to do with the absence of disease or disability. It's all about having a positive attitude, being okay with yourself, continuing to challenge yourself and grow, and feeling like you are surrounded by people that you care about. So I want to turn to get closer to the kind of work that I do. And what I want to suggest is that when we talk about well-being, There are, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I think it's worthwhile to just to define slightly. There are two different flavors of well-being generally. One is hedonic, which has to do with feeling good, positive experiences. And the other is eudaimonic, which I think gets closer to the kinds of things that Jennifer Reichstadt found in her study, which is being engaged in pursuits that are meaningful to you. And these are measured in various kinds of ways, including one that I think it turns out to be particularly important, which is a sense of purpose. And I'll show you that in a bit. So why am I making this distinction? Well, part of the reason is that older adults tend to report generally being happier and more satisfied with their lives as they get older than younger adults do. And so hedonic well-being, being happy with your life, tends to be higher in later life than at any other point in the life course, at least until you get closer to death. In contrast, if you look on the right-hand side, this is the eudaimonic measures of well-being. And this is the sort of the engagement in meaningful activities. And if you look at this red line, the sort of saturated red line, that's purpose in life. And what you should be able to see is that unlike satisfaction with life, a sense of purpose and also growth is on a pretty steep decline as we get into later life. So some forms of well-being actually look worse as we get older, and particularly things having to do with a sense of purpose and growth. Now, what I want to try to persuade you is that those ideas of purpose, growth are important for health. So what we're talking about, if we go back to the Rowan-Kahn formulation, is that this idea of life engagement, not only is it a critical component of healthy aging, but it might actually influence the other aspects of aging. So it might influence your susceptibility to disease and disability. It might influence the extent to which you can retain good cognitive and physical function as you get older. This is consistent with the World Health Organization, which is health being a state of complete physical and mental social well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It's also consistent with a perspective that Jimmy Carter wrote about in his book, What's Good Health? It's more than being able-bodied, it's self-regard, it's control over your affairs, strong ties with other people, and a purpose in life. So there have been a number of ways in which the idea of health includes things like a sense of purpose and connections to other people. So what's the evidence that these things are important? Well, there are a number of ways in which we can see this. And the big one is, the ultimate health outcome is mortality. And there have been a number of studies that have been done now that show that the extent to which you have a positive attitude and the extent to which you express, you feel like your life continues to have meaning, these things are associated with living longer. And there have been a number of studies that have shown this. In nuns who entering the convent at age 22, the more they express positive emotions at age 22, the longer their lives. In a big epidemiological study in Alameda County, higher levels of well-being predicted longer life, reduced mortality. And interestingly enough, the likelihood of dying was not associated with negative feelings. It was only associated with positive feelings predicting longer life. And in the study that I've been showing you some data from, a sense of purpose is associated with also with living longer. So death, mortality, the ultimate outcome is associated with, lower risk of death is associated with a greater sense of purpose. But even short of that, if you look at older adults as they age, people who report a greater sense of purpose in their lives, not only don't they die as soon, but they also don't develop disability at the same rates. They don't develop Alzheimer's disease at the same rates. They also show good cognitive function, even if they have a lot of pathology in the brain that should mean that their cognitive function is very, very poor. So purpose in life seems to protect against age-related changes in the brain that could produce cognitive dysfunction. In my own work, we look at increases in chronic conditions, as I showed you before, and this is just a measure of psychological well-being and change in chronic conditions over time. And you can see that even independently of things like stress and depression and other predictors, having low levels of well-being, and that's the blue line going across time, across ages, the blue line is worse off. So these are people in the lowest third of scores on psychological well-being, and they are much more likely to add chronic conditions over time compared to people that have higher levels of psychological well-being, which appears to be protective against getting sicker over time. Same thing with disability. So if we look across different disability levels and different levels of well-being, the dark brown bars are people who are in the bottom third for psychological well-being. The green and the light brown bars are people that are higher levels of well-being. And you can see that people that are low in well-being are much more likely to have disability at all three of the ways of data collection. So we know that hedonic well-being tends to increase while things like purpose tend to decrease. And that's important because purpose in life is protective. It protects against mortality, and it protects, I didn't show you these, but it also is protective against things like depression, which we know is fairly common in older adults. And it buffers against the negative effects of challenges like getting older and also like having disease. So purpose is important in later life. It's an important component to health, and it declines. So the next question is, can we promote it? Can we cultivate it? If it's on the decline in later life, we want to try to stop that. And so the question is, can we boost psychological well-being and a sense of purpose in particular in aging adults? And the answer is, we hope is yes, and we have some preliminary evidence that this might be true. My colleagues and I at the University of Wisconsin have conducted a couple of pilot studies of a new intervention which is designed expressly to promote eudaimonic well-being, which is these sense of life engagement, purpose, growth, connections to other people. And the intervention is based loosely on cognitive behavioral therapy, so it's designed to help older adults think about the things that happen to them differently in such a way as to promote eudaimonic well-being. And this program takes advantage of the fact that the people that for whom it's designed have been alive for a long time. And so we use things like life review, looking back over their lives to be as a source of well-being that they could potentially bring into their current lives. The intervention in its current form is an 8-week program. It's delivered in community centers and in group classes, so about roughly 12 to 15 people per class. They meet for an hour and a half in a senior center or local library, and then they have they go home and they just record experiences of psychological well-being during the week between classes. And what we found in the pilot studies is, as hoped, we were able to see increases in eudaimonic well-being. And it doesn't look very impressive on the left-hand side of this slide, but remember that the normative pattern of eudaimonic well-being is decline. And it tends to be pretty stable or declining in older adults. So the fact that we are able to see an increase after this program is actually going against the tide. So I think it's worth bearing in mind. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see, even though we were not targeting depression, in fact, depression was not part of the intervention in any way, shape, or form, these adults that participated in the program saw a steep decline in scores on depression. And our community partners that helped us build the study and delivered it in the community told us that they rarely see declines this big, even with programs that are designed to help older adults deal with depression. We also saw drops in somatic symptoms, so just aches and pains and sort of things that are nuisances, and people started to sleep better. They had less trouble falling asleep. Again, nothing that was targeted, but it seems to flow from boosting people's psychological well-being. So from our program, we know that older adults will attend well-being-based programs. This is something that they enjoyed. It's something that they were willing to do. It's something that not even a Wisconsin winter could dissuade them from participating in. We saw significant improvements in virtually everything we measured, most notably psychological well-being, but a bunch of other things like I showed you. But what was really fun is we also asked them some open-ended questions and saw anecdotal evidence for other kinds of life changes. So I want to show you a few of those. This is from one gentleman who attended the classes, said, I learned that most of my bad feelings about getting old are fixable by me, which is the cognitive behavioral kind of approach. My approach and outlook are paramount to getting through and enjoying the last part of me. Another woman said, I do things with friends more. I'm exercising more. So, one of the tantalizing potential outcomes of boosting well-being is that you also enable people to make important changes in their lives that might also have impact on their health. So seeing friends, being more socially connected, but also becoming more physically active. And we just submitted a grant in October to start to look at these things a little bit more systematically to see if people really are making changes in their behavior as a result of feeling more connected to psychological well-being. And then, you know, sort of this idea of adjusting to the reality of aging. You know, we're not pretending that people aren't getting old. This is not just sort of be happy. It's that, yes, you face real, genuine challenges. Diseases are difficult to manage. Disability limits what you can do. But as one participant said, the trick is to continue on, even in the face of these obstacles. On a cruise, I rent a scooter so I can get where I want to go, but I still go. So the last thought I want to leave you with, and I want to just emphasize this, is that the way we think about well-being, it's not sort of pop psychology ideas of well-being. It's not the absence or particularly the denial of adversity. Aging is difficult, and the kinds of things that happen are difficult to face and deal with. And the idea is that what we look for, and what we try to help older adults do, is to find opportunities for and sources of well-being, even in the midst of the adversity. And we know from a number of different pieces of evidence that adversity can actually facilitate well-being, that is successfully adapting to life demands at any age, and then particularly in later life, can promote well-being. And the idea is that we want to promote the ability to recognize and savor things that are positive in our lives, even when our lives have a lot of adversity in them. So just to come back to where we started, you may not have noticed, but buried in amongst all of these negative images of aging are more positive ones, like respect, happy, active, wise, experienced, interesting. And so, you know, there are a number of goals that could flow from this. One is to try to flip the size, have things like active and interested and respect be much larger than things like forgetful and slow. And the extent to which we can do that could have very real implications for how older adults age and the ability to remain active even in the face of failing health and declining abilities. And that's where I will stop, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. This was a great presentation. I think it gives us all something to look forward to in the aging process of what we need to do. There are a couple of questions here. I just wanted to comment when you put up the 4 things about successful aging, about the positive attitudes, self-acceptance, purpose and growth, and social relationships. Here in Indiana, with our health and human science extension educators, all of us read the book probably about 3 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, on the blue zones.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the first one, the positive attitude, purpose and growth, and social relationships, when you were talking about the things, it made the blue zones book kind of pop into my brain, because those 3 things seem to be common themes through each of those blue zones.
Very much so, yes.
So there are 2 questions here. So the first one is, isn't a person thinking they are better off than others a barrier to instilling behavior change?
That's a good question. Possibly, although what we found was, so I guess there are 2 ways that I can answer that. One is, I think it's an adaptive way to go about life. We tend to have positive biases about how we're doing, and a lot of psychologists have identified the fact that we tend to overestimate how well we're doing and our abilities and so on, but that's an important component of well-being. But one of the things that we found, and I'm going to answer this, I'm going to take a sort of sideways turn on this. One of the tricks that we found when we were trying to get this pilot study up and running was our community partners advised us that there were better and worse ways to market it to try to get participants. And what we found, or what they told us, and what we found was that if we tried to invite people to participate in the program because we were going to make their lives better, you know, like we can help you deal with depression, and we can help you with the fact that you're maybe have disabilities. We want to try to improve you. That was not a selling point. But if we, the slogan that our community partners came up with was "Enjoy the journey," and the idea was that not to try to make them feel like there was anything wrong with them, but just that their lives could be better. And that actually turned out to be a huge draw. So the fact that people tend to think they're doing better than everyone else isn't necessarily true, but I think it's important to try to not puncture that, but invite them to do better, and that seemed to be successful. So in our experience anyway, we could get around that inflated sense of how well people were doing, and they were very willing to come and do this program, and they got a lot out of it anyway, and recognized that they had a lot to learn.
Oh, great. Thank you. The next one has kind of two parts, and you actually kind of already answered part of this, but I'll break it down into two sections here. The person writes, with an increasing number of senior centers losing population, how do you see this well-being and social, I think it's supposed to be interaction, affecting the boomers who won't go to senior centers?
Well, that's great. That's a really, really good question. I mean, we deliberately tried to put this program in community centers because we thought that older adults would be less willing to go to clinical settings like doctors' offices and things like that. So maybe this is a moving target. I mean, if boomers don't want to go to senior centers, then we just have to find places that they are willing to go. And so that's going to be it's just like we can't do telephone surveys anymore. Now we have to do surveys using cell phones because people just don't have landlines anymore. So this is a matter of trying to figure out what would appeal to baby boomers. Where would they like to meet? Maybe they want to meet in a coffee shop or something like that. There may be ways to make these kinds of interventions more appealing. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be in a senior center. It just has to be a place where a dozen people or so can be in a room together and talking with one another.
Great. Well, the second part to this is, she wrote exactly what I was thinking too. Says, is the Lighten Up curriculum available to other states? I work with Extension, would love to implement this program. So,
yeah, I would love to as well. So the short answer to that is no. And the reason is that we are still trying to finalize it. We want to make, so we just, based on the first couple of pilot studies that we did, we want to make some adjustments to the program. And as I said, we put in a grant in this past October. We will find out if it gets funded in February or March, we hope. And at that point, we're going to invest some time and effort into finalizing the manuals. I know that in Wisconsin, I don't know if it's the same thing in Indiana, but in Wisconsin, we need to run a controlled trial. So we need to have a control group, which we have not yet done, in order for the aging network in Wisconsin to be able to take up the program and disseminate it. So that's the purpose of the grant. I don't know if Indiana requires the programs to be evidence-based, but I know Wisconsin does. So that's where we are right now, as we are trying to test the program in a controlled trial so that we can provide the evidence base to show that it's effective and efficacious, and then it can be disseminated. So at that point, yeah, I would love to see it take, I mean, then we're actually looking at potentially a multi-site trial, a much more scaled up trial, and I would love to see it tried out in Indiana.
Okay, and I'm not sure which state this person came from, but I think with people on here potentially from 12 states in the kind of north central region, that there'd be lots of states probably willing to step up and try this out in multiple states.
Great.
Another person writes, please repeat the study name, MIDUS acronym.
So MIDUS is a data set. So it's the acronym stands for Midlife in the United States. And the data, the first two waves of data from the mid-90s and the mid-2000s are publicly available. So you can find them, what the heck is it? It's ICPSR is the organization at the University of Michigan. It's a data repository. And you can find the MIDUS data there, and you can download them and work with them. The third wave of data, I think some of those data are available and some are not yet available. But I know that all of the data from the first two waves are public. Okay. So it's, yeah, midlife in the United States.
Great. Thank you. Another person asked, have you done any work with intergenerational efforts to increase well-being across the lifespan?
Intergenerational efforts? No, honestly not. Okay. Great question.
Actually, we have one of our specialists at Ohio State, or the Ohio State University. This is his field of study. So you know the person asked this question, so Sherry, I can get back with you and connect you with the person at Ohio State University. And then another question is, I have found public libraries are very good spots to conduct outreach programs in Wisconsin.
Yes, we did. We've done a number of different classes with the Lighten UP program, and some of them were indeed in a local public library. So yeah, we have found the same thing.
Yeah, those are good sites because they're neutral and usually have space, and it's a familiar setting that they might be going to anyway. So public libraries are great spots for delivering educational program. That was the questions in the chat box. Is there anyone that called in that would like to ask a live question at this point in time? I gotta say, this book by Jimmy Carter sounds very interesting and very appropriate for the topic here.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing anyone else speak up. So Dr. Friedman, I want to thank you very much for being our guest speaker today on the North Central Region Aging Network for Gerontology 101. And this will conclude today's webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks for the professional development, and then the first Friday in January of the new year for another webinar on aging. Thank you everyone, and happy